Welcome back! In today's tutorial, we are going to learn how to reharmonize simple minor key chord progressions and give them a darker, more ancient or mysterious sound using something called the Phrygian mode. It's bold, it's exotic, and as always, it's probably way easier than you realized. We're going to start with a quick breakdown of what makes the Phrygian mode unique, and then we'll reharmonize a simple minor key chord progression, before finally, I will show you how to write your own progressions that belong strictly to the Phrygian mode. So without further ado, let's get started. So right off the bat, let's start with a very simple A natural minor scale. So the Phrygian mode is another minor mode, which means, among other things, that it shares most of its notes with the natural minor scale, but with one crucial difference. So to create a Phrygian mode, all you need to do is find the second scale degree of any natural minor scale and lower it by half a step. So we start with 1, 2, here we go, it's the second note, lower it by a half step, and voila, that's it. Our A natural minor is now an A Phrygian. This trick will work with any natural minor scale. Starting with E minor, take the F sharp, lower it to F natural, and boom, you got E Phrygian. What about D minor? Take the E natural, lower it to an E flat, you get the general idea. This one altered note, the lowered second scale degree, is called the characteristic note because it's responsible for giving the Phrygian mode its most instantly recognizable tense and kind of ancient sound. And anytime we create a Phrygian mode like this, by starting with a natural minor scale, we create what's called a parallel scale, or a scale that shares the same exact starting note as another one. In this case, A natural minor and A Phrygian both start with A. And because they both start with the same note, that's what allows us to use all of the reharmonization strategies we will be working with in this video. Because the two scales start on the same note, we can swap out chords from each scale to use in our chord progression. But to do this, we have to actually find the chords of the Phrygian mode first. And to do this, we can use something called the add-skip rule. All right, we will start with a note, we will skip the very next note in our scale, and we will add the third. We will skip the fourth note in our scale, we will add the fifth. And we can repeat this process. Start with a note, skip the next one, add the third. Skip the fourth, add the fifth. You can use this strategy to find all the chords that naturally occur within any scale. And from this, we can identify which of these chords contains our characteristic note. These chords are called our characteristic chords because they contain the characteristic note. And because they contain the characteristic note, they also are primarily responsible for giving this mode all of its personality. And they tend to be particularly powerful when paired with that first chord. Oh, I just love working with modes. And like I said, it's super easy. So let's cover 3 very quick strategies that you can use to transform a simple minor key chord progression into something that sounds unmistakably Phrygian. So strategy number 1 is to end your chord progression with a modal cadence. And a modal cadence is just a characteristic chord that gets followed by the tonic chord being the very first chord of your scale. So let's say we're starting with a very basic chord progression like this. It goes A minor, E minor, D minor, G major, back to A minor, E minor, E major, and then A minor again. So this chord progression ends with a very typical cadence, something called an authentic cadence. It goes major 5 to minor 1. But if we want to get a very strong modal flavor at the very end of our chord progression, we can replace this chord with any of our characteristic chords from the parallel Phrygian. This is written in A minor, so we want to pick a chord from A Phrygian. And to create a modal cadence, like I said, all you have to do is go with a characteristic chord and then move directly into your tonic chord. For example, we could go from B flat major to A minor if we want to get a really strong Phrygian sound. Strategy number 2 is very, very similar. We're going to use the same basic idea of inserting modal cadences, but this time we'll look for opportunities to insert them somewhere in the middle of a progression. First, look for spots where you're using the tonic chord in the middle of your chord progression. For example, here in bar 5. Then, find the chord directly in front of it. In this case, it's the G major chord in bar 4. Then, finally, we just got to replace this chord with one of our characteristic chords. As an added bonus, if you want it to be a very, very smooth transition, you want to pick a characteristic chord that shares at least one note in common with our original chord. In this case, if we just take the B and turn it into a B flat, we can go from G major to G minor. We don't have to change any of the other notes. We don't even have to change the note in our bass line. It becomes a very simple transition. It goes from sounding like this to creating a much darker quality just by changing that one little note. As an added bonus, you don't have to replace the entire chord if you don't want a fully modal sound. Another perfectly valid strategy is to simply cut your chord in half, have the first half be the original chord, have the second half be your new modal characteristic chord, and then into your cadence. It creates a really fun, chromatic, kind of colorful quality of mixing two scales together. Finally, strategy number 3 is probably the simplest. All we're going to do is look for any opportunity to pop in a quick characteristic note. So for example, bar number 2, we have an E minor. If we replace this B natural with a B flat, automatically we got more of a Phrygian sound. If we go over to bar 6, we'll see the same exact situation. E minor, replace that with an E diminished by adding the B flat. And boom, just like that, we have a perfectly Phrygian colored chord progression. So now let's listen to our 2 chord progressions one after the other. First, our original minor key chord progression, and then our new Phrygian mode chord progression. During the replay, I will highlight the chords that have been modified, so you can more easily identify the changes visually as you follow along. And as a reminder, always remember to use your ears. Just because you're reharmonizing with the Phrygian mode doesn't mean you need to replace everything. Sometimes just a chord here or there is all it takes to give the color and personality that you want for your chord progression. And you are always more than welcome to use chords from 2 different scales in one chord progression. So long as you're pulling from parallel scales, it'll sound fine. But sometimes you don't want to reharmonize. Sometimes you just want to start straight from scratch writing in the Phrygian mode. And to do this, I typically like to recommend using something called period structure or sentence structure. Period structure and sentence structure are both structural patterns that get found everywhere in music. They're not so much cookie cutters or stencils. It's much more accurate to think of them like grammar. The same way that English or any language have certain patterns that most sentences will tend to follow. This doesn't prevent poets and authors and writers from being original. It just provides a little more structure to help them convey their ideas a little more clearly to their audience. It's the same with music. Using these patterns isn't going to make you sound like you're ripping off any other artist. They're just going to provide structure that your audience can relate to on a subconscious level that will help you get your ideas across more easily. So, for example, period structure follows a pattern of A, B, A, C. To use this, we're going to start with our mode, A Phrygian, and we're going to pick just 2 chords to start off our chord progression. I'm going to recommend that you start off with your tonic chord, and then immediately follow it with one of your characteristic chords, like B flat major. This combination of starting with your tonic chord and then immediately going into a characteristic chord helps to just immediately establish the kind of mode that you're working with. It sets the personality, it sets the tone, and it just makes things a lot easier for you in the long run. You don't have to. You could, in theory, pick any random 2 chords from your mode that you think really work with each other, but you do run the risk of muddying up the tonal center of your music, if you do. So now we've got our A section, we've got our first 2 chords, so let's figure out our B section, which you can pick any 2 random chords from your mode that you just think sound good together. For example, F major into D minor. Step 3 is to repeat our very first 2 chords, that original A section. This helps reinforce our original idea, it helps us establish which mode we're in, and it helps create a sense of pattern, of flow in your music. Then our final step is to create our cadence material, the way that we end our progression with typically some kind of modal cadence. In this case, let's go from a G minor to an A minor. And with that, we have our original Phrygian chord progression. Sentence structure follows the same basic idea, just in a different order. Start with your 2 chords, then repeat them, sometimes with different inversions to just add a little novelty, you know. Then find your new combination of 2 chords that you like before ending with your cadence. Now, as a reminder, modal cadences tend to sound, for lack of a better word, weaker than a strong, authentic cadence. This sound just doesn't have the same kind of weight as a nice, strong, powerful resolution like that. So if you want a stronger ending, it is perfectly fine to go with a traditional major 5 to minor 1 chord progression. Yes, it does technically step outside of the mode, but if you like the way it sounds, go for it. This is your music, it's up to you. And that wraps up another tutorial. I hope this gave you some fun ideas to experiment. If you would like to dive deeper into writing emotional, story-driven chord progressions and melodies, check out my textbook, The Musical Storyteller, a 400-plus page guide for composers who are working with ensembles, DAWs, and/or sample libraries. Digital copies are on my website, and physical copies are available on Amazon. Links are in the description below. A huge thanks goes out to my patrons and channel members. You make my videos like this possible. I appreciate each of you more than you know. So until next time, my friends, keep studying, keep working hard, and keep writing new music. I will see you all in the next video. Bye for now.